Well, hi everybody. Welcome to our class today on the timeline grid. I am super excited for this class. This tool changed my life, really. It made research so much easier for me, made tracking my research easier. So I'm really excited to share it with you and wanted to give you a special thanks for being here today. I know there's a lot of other things that you could be doing. I'm sure most of us are pretty busy. So thanks for taking time to come to this class. This is the first class in our Timeline Grid series, which only consists of 2 classes right now. Might add a third one later on, but for now we've got today's class, which is kind of an introduction, and then next week we'll give some practical examples showing the skills and so forth that we learned today. At the end of class, like usual, we're going to invite everybody to share their key takeaways. If this is your first time coming to one of these classes, basically we just invite you to listen during the class and make note of something that you think might help you or might be helpful to someone that you are assisting with family history. And then at the end, we'll invite you to share those in the chat because that can help your fellow participants as well. So if I were to mention a challenge that I think most of us face in our family history research, it would be this. When I do my research, how do I record my findings so that they're easy to organize and use? Have you ever found something and you knew it was important and maybe you put it on a post-it note or maybe you thought that you'd remember it? I've done that. Oh yeah, I won't forget that. Or you jot it down someplace in a notebook or an electronic document, and then 6 months later when you need it, where is it? Can't even find it. So that can be a challenge for those of us who are trying to research our family lines. Well, one answer to capturing and organizing that information may be the timeline grid, the topic of our class today. So here's a quick overview of what we will be covering. First of all, what is the timeline grid? Second, how do I use it? Third, how can it help me? And finally, how do I get started? So let's go ahead and dive in. What is the timeline grid? Well, you're looking at an example up here, but to explain it, the timeline grid is a table that you either create yourself or you can copy from a template. It centers on one family, one nuclear family, in other words, a set of parents and their children. It's used for countries and time periods with regular census records, and in a nutshell, it shows key family information organized into a compact space. And that's what I think makes it so powerful, is that it is organized, but it's viewable. Like it's not scattered, over several pages or whatever. It's in a very compact way so that you can almost see at a glance the things that you need to see. So it's all well and good to hear a description and even to see a blank grid, but let's walk through a little bit more detail on this so it makes more sense. So that in the timeline grid, you'll notice that the first column is labeled ID and vitals. And so in that column, I will put a PID from Family Search if I have one, or if you're using another desktop application like let's see, Ancestral Quest or Family Tree Maker or something, you could record an ID number from there. I put the name in there, and then also that's where I put the vital information such as birth, marriage, and death. The other columns are used for each census in which you expect to find the family. And then each person is listed on a separate row. I've had friends that tried to actually combine multiple people on a row, and it just got really unwieldy, mainly because in censuses, usually the family members vary from census to census, right? There'll be kids who weren't alive in 71 and then they are alive in 81. You have kids that left the house, a spouse might die, that type of thing. So it really, even though it might seem like that would be extra effort, it is easier to have each person listed on a separate row. So let's walk through actually putting, like seeing how the data works in the timeline grid. So at the top of the grid, I will always put the parents. And if you've got multiple ancestors with the same name, like I've got about 1 million Ann Guntons in my line, and I'm sure all of us have names that are reused over and over, I like to put the birth date just to help distinguish that person. And then also to help distinguish the person, it's helpful to put the parents below. So Anne is my relative. She married Thomas Guy, so he married into my family. Somebody asked me once, well, why didn't you put Thomas's parents on there? And I could have. I actually didn't think of it. And so you could put the parents of both the people that you're researching. I did my relative here, and so I've got her dad, Matthew, and her mom, Anne. So once you've kind of set the grid up, you've labeled it and so forth, then you can start plugging information in. So down here at the bottom of the screen, we've got a snippet from the 1871 census. And you'll notice here is Thomas Guy. He's the head of the family. There's Anne, his wife. There's their son, William. They actually did have more kids, but for this example, we're going to keep it simple and so that it fits on the screen. Too many more kids wouldn't have fit on our slide. So the first thing we do at the top of the screen is to type the enumeration information, so where they were enumerated. And I found that that's really helpful for a couple of reasons. One is that as I have the enumeration information for every census year, it gives me a sense of the pattern of residences. So did this family always stay in the same place, or did they move partway through? Another reason that's helpful is if all the census records are, for instance, from Doddington, and then I've got one like in 1891 from the United States, I would be saying, maybe I've made a mistake there. So that enumeration information can help you see inconsistencies that might indicate an error. Then you just type the key information from the census into the appropriate cell on the grid. So for this one, since we're in the 1871, we're just going to do them in order. So we're going to do Thomas, Anne, and William. So we start with Thomas, and I don't make this fancy, you guys. I just separate everything with commas so that it's very fast to type, but it's still legible. I can still tell what's going on. So first entry is for Thomas Guy. He's the head, he's married, he's 38 years old, he's a farmer of 16 acres, and he was born in Maney, Cambridgeshire. Then we move on to Anne, and we say she's Anne, the wife, she's married, 31. Do you see how I'm just copying out key information from the census? And let me there indicate, so to me, key information, these cells are pretty small, right? So we can't put a ton of stuff in here. So key information for me is the name, the relationship, the marital status, if it's indicated, the age, and the birthplace. Sometimes if there's additional information that I feel would be helpful, I'll note it as well. A good example that comes to mind is in some censuses, they will indicate how many children the couple have had and how many have died, or they may indicate an immigration year. So I would capture that as well. Examples of things that I don't tend to capture, one of the censuses, and somebody can tell me which one it is because I honestly don't remember. It's probably 1930 or 1940. They asked if the people owned a radio. And I think that's really cool. That is fun to see. It's interesting information. But I don't consider it key for doing my family history research. Instead, I might put it in a life sketch or some other thing that had interesting information about the family. But for the timeline grid, I keep it focused pretty much on the key information. Now, this is a good opportunity for me to say that I'm just sharing with you how I use the timeline grid, and that isn't like the way to use it. The truth is you can use it in whatever way makes sense to you. So if you wanted to include the radio information, or whether they were renting or owning is another thing that's indicated in some censuses, you should feel free to put in whatever information you want to capture in the timeline grid. And then we end up with William, the son. He's 1 year old, and he was born in Doddington. As I mentioned, I like to put the name of the person out in the first column there. It just makes it more readable. And I have to give credit to my friend Julie because I didn't used to do this. And she started doing it because she said it made it so much easier to read and to figure out who was on each row. And I tried it and I liked it. She was absolutely right. It does make it easier to have their names. In keeping with good genealogical practice, women are always entered under their maiden names or their birth names in countries where women change names upon marriage. It just makes it so much easier. That's a rule not only on Family Search, but on pretty much every other genealogy website that I'm aware of, just because it avoids ambiguity. And the problem with listing women under their married names is that one woman's married name might be the same as another woman's single name, so it can really cause confusion. So I always list the woman under her maiden name. I like to add the birth year since it's used frequently for searches, and if I don't know the birth year, I'll just put about. I'd rather have a good estimate there than nothing at all. And when I say estimate, my estimates are based on something pretty trustworthy, such as an age in a couple of censuses, from a marriage record, maybe where they gave the age. Sometimes people lied on their marriage records, especially if they wanted to say they were older than they were to get married. So, but at least if I have that information, it's a good estimate until I can find exact information. So if I don't know it, I'm just estimating it, I put about. One thing I would caution against in the way olden days, some of you will probably remember this back from, oh, I want to say about the 1980s or so, we were taught that if we didn't know, for instance, a parent's or a groom on a marriage records, if we didn't know their age, we should estimate that they were about 25 years old when they got married. Well, that was all well and good, I think, in the days before the internet when our family history efforts were relatively small when we mostly kept family history in our personal databases. But I've noticed that in a shared tree like Family Tree, it actually causes problems to do that type of thing that we used to do where you go, oh, well, I'm just going to estimate he was 25 years old when he got married, but I really don't know. Then that can lead to wrong record hints. It can confuse other researchers. So if you can get a decent estimate based on some records, yes, I would use it, but I wouldn't just use an arbitrary rule like we were taught to do years ago. So just because if you're using this for searching, you want to be as close to accurate as possible, even if you don't have an exact date yet. And then you just keep plugging information into the grid as you find it. And that's one thing I love about it is you don't have to find this stuff in order, but when you find it, you plug it in the right place, and the end result is that it is displayed in order. So in this case, the next time I found something on this family, it was in the 1891 census. So I plugged it in. And you can see that this is consistent with the other information. So they're still in Doddington. Thomas has aged about 20, 30, 40, 50, about 20 years, so that's about accurate. He's still a farmer, still born in the same place. Anne actually is an exception to the rule here. Usually women, if they're going to age differently than 20 years or, however far it was between censuses, they usually age less. Like I have an ancestor who aged 3 years between 10-year censuses. But Anne, bless her heart, she apparently aged over 20 years between the census, but she's still born in the same place. In fairness, I need to say that back then, many of our ancestors did not have the chance for an education, and many of them, as they got older, they honestly did not know their true age. So I suspect that's probably what happened here. So she's a few years off compared to what she said earlier, but all the other facts line up, and that's what's so helpful about the timeline grid is you can see if the facts really line up, and so you can see, well, is this age just a little inconsistency? Or if this had been Anne and she was 60 and she was born in Lincolnshire, then we would say, this Anne is probably not the same person as this Anne. And then, of course, we'd want to do a little more research. But it's really great for showing consistency and pointing out lack of consistency. Then we just keep adding information. So here I found an exact birth year for Anne and I added her birth registration. Same thing for her son William. And fast forward to a completed grid. So you see how this kind of lays out the family, the way they were throughout the years. So we see Thomas he's a diligent farmer all these years, serving his family, providing for them. And look at this, he did not retire until sometime between 1901 and 1911, because not until 1911, at 78 years of age, is he listed as retired. This guy was a hard worker. Another cool thing that we see on here is we've got William at home, William at home. William is not at home. He is lodging with the Norman family as a farm laborer, and by the next census, he's married to the farmer's daughter. I just love that little farmhouse romance there going on. Whoever said that family history records were boring? I did want to point out something that some of you may have been wondering about as you saw these abbreviations. B is probably pretty obvious to everybody, standing for birth, but I chose to abbreviate Cambridgeshire using the standard English abbreviation of CAMS, and just because it takes up less room. Honestly, if you wanted to spell it out, you'd totally be able to do that. BR is birth registration, Q is quarter, RD is registration district, and before you say, oh my goodness, I will never remember that, you don't have to, fortunately. So I created a legend and put it in the upper corner of the timeline grid template. Depending on which template you use, there's templates for the United States, templates for Canada, templates for the UK. So in this case, because this family lived in England, this link points to a legend for British abbreviations. So, and you don't have to use these. These are just abbreviations that I've used. You can use them if you choose to. If you don't want to use the legend, you can delete it. So this gives you a lot of flexibility, but I've just found it helpful to have at least a few common abbreviations I use, again, just to save space. What about text color? I bet some people were noticing that too. So when someone is enumerated in the same household, I'll use the same color. But William here has not moved out of the home. Oh, well, no, I shouldn't say that. He did move out of the home, but he hasn't started his own family yet. And so really he's still, the son of this mom and dad. And if he weren't off being a farm laborer, he probably would have still been living at home. So I chose to list him still here on this row because he hadn't started his own family yet. But since he's in a different location, I colored his enumeration information orange and I colored him orange, so it makes it easy to see, okay, this is the son in this family, but he's not living with the parents right now. This is where he is, but mom and dad are still there and they're still in the original color. And then notice that when he got married, I started a new grid for him and his wife and their children. Yeah, I used to try and do them multi-generationally all on one grid, and it just turned into a bowl of spaghetti. It was such a mess. It was so hard to read and hard to keep track of. So I felt that it made it a lot easier to just do one nuclear family per grid, a set of parents and their children until they leave home or until they marry and start their own families. One thing I have found it helpful to do is to display both the historical record and the timeline grid at the same time. So you can either, if you've got a large monitor, you can just open up two different windows, browser windows, and have them side by side. Or if you have two monitors, you can put one on one monitor and one on the other. And I found it makes it easier to be able to see them both at once. Okay, so those are the basics of the timeline grid, but now let's talk about some of the bells and whistles that you can use in these type of electronic documents. We're going to talk about how you can use hyperlinks and comments, text and background colors. We looked at that a little, but we'll go into more detail. How you can make a to-do list, a very simple to-do list, and how you can take advantage of collaborative features such as those that Google Drive offers. Since I use Google Drive for my timeline grids, I'll talk about Google Drive, but similar features are available in just about any other cloud service, such as Dropbox Paper, OneDrive, Evernote. Any kind of cloud service where you can store information and documents will allow you to do the types of things that we're talking about. So hyperlinks, what do we use hyperlinks for? Well, I use them to link to other grids. So this right here, this hyperlink links to the timeline grid for Anne's parents. This one links to the grid, as you probably surmised from our last slide. It's the timeline grid for William and his new wife and their children. And then, of course, that will trace them throughout the census. Then also, this has made it so easy to be able to link to sources in the timeline grid. So I will just create a hyperlink pointing to whatever source I used for this information. And it makes it just so easy if you ever have a question or you want to get back to it or look at the image or whatever, you just click on the link and it takes you straight to the source. Here's another example of sourcing where I link to the birth registrations. Now, people always ask, okay, that is really cool, but I did not even know that you could make a hyperlink in a Google Doc or a Word doc or whatever. How on earth did you do that? So I added this little quick tip to the lesson just because so many people would ask for a demo of how to make a hyperlink. So in this example, we are going to make a link to the timeline grid for Eliza's parents, Thomas and Anne. So the first thing we want to do is actually go over to their grid. So I have opened up their grid here and I want to copy this URL in the address bar, the URL of their timeline grid. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is that usually if you bring that up and then you just click once inside it, I don't know if I can say usually, maybe often is more accurate. Often it will be automatically selected. But if it's not, in other words, it doesn't have this highlight on it, it's not selected, then it's actually pretty easy to select it. You can hit Control A on a PC, Command A on a Mac, or you can right click and choose Select All. But the bottom line is we want to select this address so that we can copy it. So once it's selected, we can either right click and select copy or press Control C, Command C. By the way, we will give a link to this slide deck at the end. So if you want these instructions, just check them out in the slide deck rather than having to write them all down right now. So once you've copied it, the link will be stored in your computer's clipboard, on your computer's clipboard. Then you go back to the text that you want to put the link on. So it was remember it's our text for Thomas and Anne, the parents of Eliza. So we use our mouse to select this text and it becomes highlighted. And then once it's selected, we can either right click on the text and in Google Drive you would select link. It'll be something very similar in other apps like in Microsoft Word. I think it actually says hyperlink instead of link, but you'll be able to tell what it is. It's something about linking. Also, a common keystroke for hyperlinks is Control K or Command K. And you might be saying, what does that have to do with a link? Well, I think they chose it because it's the last letter of the word link. And this Control K also works in Microsoft Word. When you either right-click and choose link or hit Control or Command K, you get this little dialog box here, which allows you to paste in the link. So that is the next step, is to paste that link that we copied earlier. Here are the steps or the keystrokes or mouse movements that you can do for that. And then when you've pasted it in, you just click Apply. And voila, you've got a workable link. So at any time, you can easily jump over to this timeline grid. How do you add comments? Well, what do you use them for actually? So I found that it's helpful to me because these cells, again, these table cells are so small. If I have extra explanatory information that I don't want to lose, I will often put it into a comment. One thing I will do there too is I will put negative search results. So did I search something where I expected to find the information but I didn't? If so, that's helpful to know that I have searched that record collection, and the fact that there's no information isn't because I didn't search, if that makes sense. And sometimes too, I will come back years later and look at a negative search, and I will realize that my skills have grown over the years, and then I'll go search again and I'll know better, how to use wildcards or how to do other creative types of searching. And sometimes I'll find that record that I couldn't find before. So it's good to keep track of negative search results just so that you know you searched it and maybe you want to try again later. So how do you add a comment? It's actually very similar to adding a hyperlink. It starts with selecting the text that you want to attach that comment to. When you do that in Google Drive, you're going to get this set of icons. You want to click the top one, which is like a comment bubble with a plus in it, which apparently means add a comment. So I click that. And then I can, oh, I forgot, I have these things here that if you don't want to, like if you're more of a keyboard person than a mouse person, instead of clicking the comment icon, you can click any of these keystrokes or mouse movements that are described here. And then when you do that, you're going to get a little pop-up that lets you type in the comment. And when you're done with a comment, you click comment, or depending on the app, it might be OK or save or whatever. But you click whatever you need to save that comment, and then it appears out in the right-hand margin. And I've noticed, at least in Google Drive, sometimes I'll have multiple comments and it's not immediately obvious which text the comment is connected to. If you click the comment, at least in Google Drive, it will turn the text, the highlight of the text, darker than the other comments so that you can tell which text the comment box is pointing to. Okay, let's talk about using text or background coloring. So there are a number of different ways that you can use that. One, as we mentioned before, is to distinguish between different censuses for different family members in the same year. Another thing that you can do is, for instance, mark unproven items. So Anne doesn't show up in this census, and so she could be deceased. She's old enough that it's likely that she could have died between 1901 and 1911. But if I haven't proven it, then I could put a comment here to remind me that I need to find evidence that she actually had passed away by then. Another thing that I'll do sometimes, so we are looking now at the timeline grid for William Carter Guy, the son, on the other timeline grid that we were looking at. I found that sometimes it's helpful to keep the parents on the grid of a child even after they leave home and get married. But I found that when I did that, I would sometimes get confused. I would think that I was still looking at the parents' grid, even though I really wasn't. So I decided to start shading the parents a light gray or a light blue or something, just something to set them apart. So I realized whenever I see a shaded set of parents, they are the parents of the person that the grid is about, but they aren't the main person in the grid, if that makes sense. So I can still see William in his context before he got married, and I can see what's been happening to his parents, but the main focus of the grid is William and his wife and his children. Now, do you have to keep the parents in here? Absolutely not. You can do whatever works best for you, whatever makes the grid the most readable and helpful for your family history research. Another thing I like to do is put a brief to-do list at the top of my grid. Now, this is not like a function or a feature in Google Drive, It's just text. I just type the word to do and then I make a numbered list and I put the tasks that I want to remember. This is especially helpful if I'm working and then I have to stop and fix dinner, or I have to, do whatever. I have to stop doing family history at that time. Maybe I'm not going to be able to get back to it for a few days or a week or whatever. So to have a record of what my next steps are can be incredibly helpful. Maybe you've had this same experience that I've had, is that I will be interrupted or have to stop doing my family history, and I'll think, oh, I'll remember the next steps when I come back. Surely I won't forget that. And sometimes, even if it's a few hours, I've already forgotten it. So, as the Chinese proverb goes, the palest ink, or we could say words on a screen, the palest ink is better than the best memory. So, writing it down can save you a lot of duplicate work or just plain frustration at forgetting things. One thing I will do after I've completed these to-do items, if I want to remember them, and sometimes I don't, sometimes they're just really fast and simple and I just didn't want to forget them. So then I just delete the item that I've completed. But if I want to remember that I've done it, then I put the word done at the bottom of the grid and I just cut the to-do item from the top and paste it in at the bottom so I have a record of things that I have done. Again, this is not high tech at all. It's just plain old text, but it's quick and easy. Okay, let's talk about using a cloud service for timeline grids. Some people do like to print these out, but I found that the majority of people that use the timeline grid do prefer to keep them electronically. So what are the benefits of using a cloud service such as Google Drive? Well, you can access the grids from multiple locations and devices. So if I'm in the office at work, I can bring it up there. If I'm at the family history library, I can bring it up. If I'm at my sister's house, I can bring it up. You get the picture. It's just really nice to be able to access your research any place that there's an internet connection. You can collaborate with other researchers, so it's very easy to share your electronic documents and to control who sees them and what level of access they have. So for instance, when I'm working with my sister, she and I give each other full access to the grid, so each of us can edit and so forth. But when I post a timeline grid as a source in Family Tree, I don't want people to be able to edit that. So that I might set it so the link is viewable by anybody, but that they cannot change anything on the timeline grid. The advantages, okay, I already said that we could edit the same timeline grid if you give the correct permissions. Another cool thing is that you can chat online. Google Drive actually has a chat feature that you can access from within a Google document or spreadsheet. So you can actually be chatting about a document that you're both looking at the same time. And then also you can leave comments for each other. You can search timeline grids. So Google search is, of course, legendary. It's just so amazing. Well, it's the exact same in Google Drive. So I'll just give you an example of when this was very useful to me. So I was working on a family and they lived in the very unique place called Huff on the Hill. It's spelled Hough, but I asked my friend Colin, who lives in England, how to pronounce it, and he checked actually. He called somebody in the area and found out that it was pronounced Huff. And I just have to laugh about that because I wonder if someone was kind of huffing up the hill. So anyway, it's called Huff on the Hill, and I had it working on this family, and then I got moved over to some other research, and I didn't work on this family for probably 3 or 4 years, if I'm remembering right, maybe 5. Then I was researching and I came across someone else born in Huff on the Hill. Do you think I had any clue who the family was from 5 years ago or 4, however long it had been, who that family was? I did not. I could not have even told you their name. The only thing I remembered was Huff on the Hill. Well, I went into Google Drive and used the search box at the top of the Drive page and searched for Huff on the Hill, and right away it found that timeline grid of that other family that I had been researching that lived in the same location. So the search is wonderful, and other platforms will allow, they have search functionalities as well. Another thing I super, super love about Google Drive is that you have automatic version control. You don't have to set it up. You don't have to hassle with it. It's just there. And one time in one of these classes, somebody asked me how far back the version control went, and I didn't know. So I had to check online, did some Googling, and discovered that it goes back to the very beginning of the time that you created the document. Now, they don't save every little change that you make, but I've noticed that they tend to save it by what you might call sessions. So when I stop working on a timeline grid, it seems like they take a snapshot of it that way, and they timestamp it. So there's a date and a time on it. And then the next time I start working will be a new version. And again, we don't have to do anything. Google just manages it. Although you do have the option to create a version if you want to. You can manually create a version of a timeline grid or of any Google Doc. I'll give you an example of one time that this was really helpful to me. So I was trying to delete a row. For some reason, I didn't need it anymore. And instead, I accidentally chose to delete the column, but I didn't realize it at the time. So then I came back to the timeline grid like a week later or something, opened it up, and it was incomplete. I was like, where's that column? What's going on with this? Because you saw that it had columns for every census. Well, there was a column missing, and all the censuses were not there. And I couldn't believe it. So at first I was just really puzzled. How could this happen? Well, I went back into version control and saw that, yes, it was user error. And I had accidentally deleted the column when I meant to delete the row. And so I was just able to copy that column from version control and then paste it back in. You can restore a whole version if you want to, but honestly, I find that most of the time I just find the thing that I want to get back, whether it's one bullet point or a link or whatever it might be, just copy it out of version control, then go back to the current version and paste it in. So version control can save you a lot of heartache. Okay, next section, how can the timeline grid help me in my research? Next week with the examples, we'll go into a lot more detail, but for this week, here are just some high points of how the timeline grid can help us in our research. As I've kind of indicated before, one thing I love about the grid is it gives us an overall picture of the family. We get to know them. So you noticed we could tell the story of this family. Thomas, the hardworking father and farmer, worked until he was in his 70s. He didn't retire until then. He had the same wife through all the years, which wasn't always the case. Sometimes spouses died, so they were fortunate that they were able to spend a long life together. We saw how the son grew up and then moved away from home, married the farmer's daughter. After I look at this, I feel like I know this family. And I see that they lived in Doddington, and so if I want to, I can go to Wikipedia or wherever and read about Doddington. What was it like? What was the lifestyle like? What occupations did people have? Perhaps in addition to farming. It's just all this information helps me know the family and gives me ideas for other things I can research about that family, such as where they lived. And again, this is all on one screen. This isn't like a big long document that I have to wade through, or for instance, in a research log, if I kept it in the order, like if I documented my sources in the order in which I found them, they're not necessarily in chronological order. So that makes it harder to get a sense of the family from something that's not in chronological order, whereas with this one, you just see the family throughout the years. Research status at a glance. We've kind of talked about this, but as a reminder, if I see this column that's blank, I know that I need to find that family. If I see under Jane's name that there's nothing, I know that I need some vital information on her. And then, of course, there's the to-do list if you choose to put one at the top of your grid. Another thing that I love to do is to use the timeline grid as a guide to enter or to fix information in Family Tree. And I also use it when I'm entering names for the temple that I want to clear for temple work. So I get my grid up on one side of the screen, and then I put Family Tree on the other side so that I can see them both at the same time. And then I see the information that I've researched, and I can very carefully and accurately enter this information into Family Tree. So those are just the high points. And again, we'll go into more detail next week. But if you do feel that you'd like to try the timeline grid, where do you go from here? Well, the first thing I would do is to choose an application. Where do you want to work? I have kept mine in Google Drive. I have a dear friend who keeps everything in Evernote. She loves Evernote. You may prefer to use some other application. It honestly doesn't matter. Any application that will let you create some kind of a table or grid can be used for the timeline grid. When you've decided where you want to work, then the next step is either to create the grid manually, or you can download a template, and we'll give you a link on that in just a second. Then choose a family that you want to research using the grid. I would recommend when starting out, choose a pretty simple family. Like, don't probably choose one that emigrated, or don't choose one with 12 kids or whatever. Choose a really simple one just to get your feet wet with it and to see if it's something that you do want to continue using. And then you just find the information about that family, all the information to plug in the grid, and you plug it in. And then you can use the timeline grid to find even more information and extend your family lines. So templates are available on my website, and here is a link. Let me just grab that, and I'm going to put it in the chat. But this is what it looks like when you go to this page. So at the top, there's just some overview information, links to other presentations if you're interested. And then down here, we've got just the different templates. The application is listed on the left. The size is listed in the box. We've got letter, legal, obvious ones for our European and English friends. If you're using A3, A4 size paper, we have some of the grids that are available in that size. If you want instructions for downloading these templates, the instructions for Google Drive, you just click here and it drops down these little instructions, and same thing for non-Google documents. Just shows you how to get that template onto your own device or machine. So that is that. Let's see.
Catherine, we have a
Yeah.
couple of comments and questions we ought to
Oh, wonderful.
deal with. Let's go back. There's one from Angela asked, have you had situations where everything matches except where they list their parents were born and it changes between censuses?
So where everything matches
Just
except
where the birthplace of their parents,
oh, and the birthplace of the parents
and it
changes
changes.
between censuses? Yes, Angela, that's a really good question. So if you can envision with me, a lot of U.S. censuses will say where the parents of the person enumerated were born, even if those parents are not enumerated with that family. And so, yeah, Angela, that's one thing I really find the timeline grid helpful for, is I can see the inconsistencies. And so then I can evaluate, is everything else the same except the parents' information in the census? And if everything else lines up, then I generally will assume that somebody who gave the census taker the information made a mistake. But if it changes all over the place and there are other inconsistencies, such as in one census the guy is a farmer and in the next one he's a lawyer, or some, some kind of switch that doesn't make sense and the kids don't line up and that type of thing, then I start to question myself and say, maybe, the facts aren't lining up. Maybe I haven't really found the family that I thought I found. So, Angela, thanks for asking that question.
She also makes a useful comment. I think she said, I added a column, the family search ID, so I can easily find the person in Family Search.
Love it. Yeah, I generally put the ID in that first column, but if it makes it easier for you to do another column, by all means, I would do that. So yeah, the timeline grid is super flexible. You can adapt it however you want. Angela, thank you.
And the Gardendale sisters just asked, how do you label and save your timeline grids in Google Drive?
I love that question. Do you know what? Let me go over here to Drive and I'll show you. And we need to, let's search for grids. So I will generally just put the name of the couple. And sometimes I'll put as I mentioned earlier, I'll put the birth year. So it might say Walter Burke, 1871, and Mary Lindsay. So I find that I'll be honest with you, sisters. Usually what I do is search for the people. So the naming in Google Drive isn't as important as maybe it would have been, if you're using paper documents. And so that's why I just use the name of the parents. But like the example I gave of searching for Huff on the Hill, or if I was searching for, whatever as Stephen Bescaby, I would just go up here to the search bar and type it in, and that's how I would find the stuff. So that's how I name my grids. And basically, for what that's worth, is this name is the same as the name at the top of the grid. So that's one way to do it, but you may think of a way that you would prefer to do it that is different than that. So thank you, sisters. Any other questions, Elder Anderton?
I think that, let's see, somebody just did something. If
I
someone merges your person with another one, the Family Search PID will change. How do you take care of this, or is that really a problem?
Oh, that's a good point. I have not tracked changes in PIDs in my timeline grids. The reason that you might not need to, I mean, you could, but if you click the old PID, it will actually take you to a screen that shows that it has been deleted, and it will show you the PID that replaced that one. So even with the old PID, you would be able to find the current one. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, Angela said you can still search the PID because it does not actually delete the person, just hides it.
Oh, good point, Angela. Yeah, she's right. You can search by PID and it will bring you to that deleted screen. And then you can find the surviving person. So we just noted here that there are versions for these different applications and for these different countries. And if you have a request for another country, please let me know and I'll just make a template for that country. So far, this seems to hit the use case for most of the people using the timeline grid, but I'd be very, very happy to add timeline grids for other countries where censuses are used. So that brings us to the end. By way of summary, the timeline grid helps you know your families, remember what you found and what you're still trying to find, improve accuracy, and collaborate with others. So at this point, we'd love to have you share your key takeaways in the chat. And just so you know what you're getting with the handout, it actually lists all the classes in the series. So class 1 we did today, got a link to the slide deck, got a link to the templates, and then also a link to a participant survey. We would love to get your feedback on this class, both what you liked and what you'd like us to change, because we do take your feedback seriously. And then down at the bottom, we've got a fun thing. If you would like to join our Relative Finder group for these Sunday classes, follow these instructions and you can see how you're related to other class participants. Oh, you know what? Bonnie just made a really helpful comment that I'd like to repeat, especially because the chat will not be visible to people that are listening to the recording. So she said, this is the second time I've taken this class, and this time it made more sense. So Bonnie, that is such a great takeaway, because sometimes the first time we're exposed to something, we're so busy trying to process, like our brains are so busy trying to process things that all the details don't sink in, right? So if today was your first exposure to the timeline grid, you might let it settle for a while and then come back and watch the recording again, or come to the next time we teach this class, which will be in about 16 weeks or so. And so, yeah, Bonnie, I found the exact same thing with classes when the first time it just doesn't all sink in, and the second time it does make more sense. So, thank you. Oh, Denise says she seconds Bonnie's comment that it sunk in better the second time. But Sister Wonderly, I will call you, mentioned that Denmark has census records. And actually, to my embarrassment, I have to admit that I started making Denmark templates and then didn't finish them. I apologize. So it sounds like there would be use for those templates. So I will get those made and get those posted on the site. Thank you very much for that reminder. Oh, Angela, I love it. She says even the third time she got more. You know, that actually reminds me of scripture study. Have you guys ever noticed that? That you can read a passage that you've read a bazillion times, and then you suddenly get a new insight that you hadn't gotten before. There's value in repetition. Oh, Charlene, it looks like this is the theme. Thanks, Charlene. She says she watches certain classes over and over and does learn something new every time. And that also brings a really good point that there's always something to learn. Okay, Nancy is voting for a Denmark timeline grid. Nancy, I will make one. Thank you. Gordon says research requires a good organizational system so you can quickly recall information, and the timeline grid works well. By recording your research, Gordon says you stop going in circles. Oh, Delary says, did you say that you add the timeline grid as a source for the persons involved? And yes, I do. So I need to be better at it. I have only added it to a few people. So let me show you how I would add a timeline grid to someone as a source. So let's see, let's try and find, nope, no Bescabies. Who have I been working on lately? Sterlins. I'm trying to find somebody, yeah, here we go, somebody in Family Tree that we can pop right to. So the way I would add a timeline grid as a source is I would go into Sources and I would click Add Source, and then I would click add a new source, and this one is going to ask me for a URL. So I do add source, and I will, for the date, I struggle with this, to be honest, and so I've put often the range of like the earliest event in the grid to the latest. So I might do something like from 1841 to 1911, and this is actually a legitimate date in Family Tree. They have a number, and you can look in the Knowledge Center, like find the knowledge articles. You can click this circled question mark and then search for something like date ranges or dates in Family Tree or something like that. So for instance, just a plain date is acceptable. About ABOUT is acceptable. This from blank to blank is acceptable. There's about 5 or 6 different standard ways that you could put dates in Family Tree that are accepted by the system and acknowledged as being standard. So I'll do something like that, and then for the title I'll just put something like timeline grid for the, I'll just make this up, okay, the May and James, well, Sterling's her maiden name. I'll just say, how about timeline grid for the May and James, maybe I do Sterling. You can tell I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head here. Let's say Jones family. This just, there's no hard and fast rule about this. I would just do something that makes sense to name the grid. And then for the URL, I would just go to the timeline grid, grab the URL and paste it in here. And then in the notes, there's not really a citation. I guess you could say it's in Google Drive or Evernote or wherever it is, but it's not a source in the traditional sense. So I actually don't think I even fill that out. And then under notes, you can explain what the timeline grid is. You can explain why you're attaching it because it gives a overview of the whole family or whatever. So since this is just a hypothetical example, I'm going to cancel out of this. But that is how you would attach a timeline grid as a source.